discuss long-term care, communication, and support for student athletes recovering from traumatic brain injuries, we're very excited to introduce an interdisciplinary panel of experts. So everyone on our long-term care panel, can you please come and take a seat?
Dr. Peter Kriz, a sports medicine doctor with special expertise in throwing injuries, musculoskeletal ultrasound, and sports concussion management at University Orthopedics. And then we have Beth Conroy, an assistant athletic trainer at Brown with experience in lacrosse, swimming, diving, soccer, volleyball, and rugby. Dr. Steve Small, professor of neurology, neurobiology, and behavior and cognitive sciences at the UC-Irvine, and the director and chief scientific officer of the Medical Innovation Institute, a new initiative of the UC-Irvine Health School of Medicine. Catherine Axe, the associate dean of students and the director of student accessibility services at Brown University. And Tara Srinivas, the founder and president of Brown Synapse, an undergraduate student organization devoted to supporting students recovering from traumatic brain injuries. All right.
So we have a few prepared questions for you all, and then we'll open it up to anyone else who has any questions for these people. So just to start off with, can we just go down this row and briefly introduce yourself and explain what role you serve in sports-related TBI support?
Steve Small, and I'm primarily a researcher in Division I athletics, looking at head impacts, irrespective of concussion. So we're measuring head impacts and focusing on research in asymptomatic head impacts, trying to understand how head impacts relate to brain function.
Peter Kriz, I'm a primary care sports medicine physician. I'm an assistant team physician here at Brown. I do a large proportion of the Brown student-athlete concussion management. I do clinical research in sport-related concussion, primarily in high school athletes, but also see a number of high school teams in the Providence area community. I also do concussion management for the Providence Bruins, which is an AHL hockey team here in town.
Hi, my name is Tara Srinivas. I'm actually an undergrad at Brown. And I'm helping run our sort of undergraduate TBI support group here on campus. So we help with anyone really, but also athletes specifically, who's received a concussion or any type of brain injury. And we provide support groups on a bi-weekly basis for people to get to know each other and sort of share resources that have helped them through the academic recovery process. And some other programs as well that help really anyone who has had a brain injury.
Hi, I'm Beth Conroy. I'm one of the athletic trainers here at Brown University. My job is to help educate the coaches and the athletes and the administrators on what concussions are, and then be the front line to get the athletes to report the concussions, treat the concussions. I help them get connected with people like Dr. Kriz and Dean Axe here, and get them the academic support that they need as well.
Thanks. So I'm Kathy Axe, and I work in student and employee accessibility services. So we help any student who may have an injury related to sports or another type of head injury that results in a concussion if the concussion persists. So we're working primarily with people that are having a more long-standing impact. I'm also here to represent the student support deans, if it's okay to just introduce their services.
Absolutely.
Too. Dean Grenadier, Mary Grenadier, is the primary sort of liaison for that office. And she wanted me to explain just briefly that they're really the front line support for students with concussions. So they'd be working with Beth Conroy, with some of the other trainers and coaches in athletics to really support students initially as they receive the injury, because they may need time out, they may need a dean's note so they're not missing from class and people are wondering where they are. And so that frontline support usually lasts over a period of about 2 weeks, at which point if the athlete or the person with the concussion hasn't recovered fully, they'll be likely to be referred on to our office for more long-term support at that point. And I think that's about it.
Great, thank you everyone. So the following questions can be answered by any or all of you if you feel that they apply to you. So my first one's pretty general. How have attitudes towards concussion and brain injury changed since you've been at Brown or in the concussion field in general?
Well, I mean, I could speak to this a little bit because I've seen patterns over time. I mean, I think we're doing a much better job of recognizing concussions and understanding the true impact of them. As someone actually who's had concussions, I think the old rule of thumb was, whatever you felt like doing, you did it as fast as possible. And I think people really are understanding the importance of balancing things and listening to and paying attention to symptoms. And also really understanding that, especially for someone for whom this lasts, there are a lot of other impacts to think about in terms of a person's identity if they can't continue in their sport, in terms of long-term learning impact if they're still experiencing headaches. So I think we're doing a better job of providing all-around support as well as sort of setting students up to have success in recovering, and I think that's really an important change.
In my 11 years here at Brown, when I first started here, concussions pretty much were only reported if the athlete felt that they were severely concussed. They did not understand that a headache was a symptom and that could be the only thing you feel at the time, but then when they went to do their academic work, they had trouble putting their papers together. And at Brown, you're all highly intelligent student athletes, and the ability to perform your paper on time or do well on your tests is very important to you in the career that you're going to go down the rest of your life. So the big impact was there was no academic support when they had concussions 10 years ago. Now they get academic support, and it's trying to get the professors to understand the limitations that come when you suffer concussion sometimes.
I mean, I've only been here for 2.5 years since I'm still an undergrad, so I can't really speak to how it's changed long term. But I am very privileged to be able to interact with people who join Synapse and are on our support groups. And I think that sort of the longstanding theme amongst grad students, amongst undergrads, people in the Providence community, is that concussions are not very recognizable on a physiological level. So people don't necessarily understand that somebody who's had a concussion can still be going through symptoms and experiencing difficulties with their academic work, even 2-3 years after the concussion. So I think that's something that we're trying to, at least in Synapse, change attitudes about and help recognize.
I don't think I can answer this in less than 2 minutes. So I've been doing this since fellowship. I ended in 2010, so I've kind of I've been involved with concussion as it's been evolving. Certainly there's better recognition, there's better education. I still think we're lacking with knowledge transfer and action stages of concussion. I think I've had some personal experience with this with my daughter, who is a freshman at Division III college, going through the whole recruiting process. I think now we live in a society where sports are so emphasized that this road for a lot of student athletes begins when they're 8, 9, 10 years of age. There's a lot of investment, time, money, and expectations. And so I think, we think about concussions occurring as the concussion that happens at college, but a number of these athletes have been sustaining head injuries for 8, 10 years, and some of them may reach their critical threshold where that next hit is the one that really is the one that doesn't allow them to continue. When I see Ivy League athletes and student athletes, I say, you've reached the pinnacle. You're here. You've made it. You're at one of the best institutions in the world to get an education. Sports are important in your life, but I hope you take the opportunity to make the most of your education here. You can play sports the rest of your life. It doesn't have to be a collision sport. And so I'm pretty passionate about this topic. I'm involved in a number of different levels, and when I started out, I didn't necessarily want to do a lot of management of concussion, but that's what ultimately got me to go into a fellowship. I'll tell you a quick story, and we'll pass it on. But I was a general pediatrician about, 13, 14 years ago, and I was walking into a room, and I heard a father coaching his son on how to remember concentration, and we do digit recalls. And he said, think about it like a phone number. So he was coaching his son on how to essentially pass the test. And I thought, this is really contorted. Here I am. It's 2005, I think. And it was before concussion really came along. And I said, we need more people. We talk about the VOMs, and we can go on about the VOMs, but we need more people managing sports concussion and having some expertise in this. So I'll stop there.
So I'm a broken record on neuroscience, I guess. When I trained in neurology, People who had concussions, we didn't know how to take care of them. We didn't really do much at all. If someone had a concussion, we figured, they get better. You send them home from the emergency room and tell their mom or their spouse to wake them up in the middle of the night and make sure they're okay. But if they didn't develop post-concussive symptomatology, we didn't really pay any attention to them. And then if they developed post-concussive symptomatology, most of us didn't know what to do with them either, except we know how to deal with migraines, so we treat the migraines, and we know how to deal with some of the symptoms. But there was no real coherent approach to dealing with concussion. And the last 3 or 4 years now, there's been an American Academy of Neurology. That's our big professional organization. There's been now an annual concussion meeting conference, mostly focused on clinical issues. And I think the NFL has done us a big favor, and those poor men who sacrificed their lives with CTE have done us a favor, because the newspapers and all the media now are really very much interested in this issue. And I think that awareness has led us to delve into all the different kinds of athletics and all the different kinds of injuries, and has led me, I wasn't doing this 5 years ago, led me to say, what is going on in the human brain that leads to all this symptomatology, and when does it occur, and what's the duration of it? We know something about that in rats, but we don't know that much about it in people. And so we're really, it's been a bit of a revolution the last few years, I think, and I'm pretty excited about it, because I think 10 years down the road, we may have a rational physiologic basis to make decisions.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to ask you one more question, and after that, we're going to open it up to the general audience. We have other questions prepared in case no one has any questions, but we just want to make sure we get everyone's voices heard. So I'm just going to ask you all, has a student athlete ever come to you with concerns about long-term effects of an injury, and how do you typically respond to that sort of question?
I'm going to pass this on to my sports medicine colleague.
I would say most of them come to us with that concern. And it's very difficult to provide guidance. I think, we could all stand on which side of the room we are in this discussion. There have been some recent commentaries by someone by the name of Christopher Randolph. He's a neurologist in Loyola in Chicago, and I can provide you some of those references. But is CTE a disease? And we can talk about whether it is. It's certainly a finding post-mortem. But his theory is that perhaps what we're seeing is an earlier clinical expression of these neurodegenerative conditions in people that would have developed them later in life, and you're just seeing it decades earlier with these repetitive head hits, and whether or not this is just in these athletes, we're seeing an earlier clinical expression of this, and it's intriguing. I don't think any of us are willing to say that repetitive head impacts are not causing neurodegenerative conditions.
The pathology is different. The pathology is different.
It is, right, yeah. And so I think it's really important for us to have these conversations and for the science to continue, because people will, I think there's a lecture later on that the media may be ahead of the science on this, and I think a lot of us would agree with this. So a lot of, where I'm going with this is a lot of athletes come in terrified about their futures, and there are some smaller studies, and that's the problem. We don't have these large multi-center studies, and they're decades away from being completed, but to give the answers we need. So how are we going to guide athletes to whether they continue their college athletic career, or if they're playing a collision sport or not a collision sport, and do they just become a student, and rather than a student athlete in their inherent sport, or do they pick up track? So it's very hard, because here we are in 2018 without all the answers, and I think common sense really has to be part of the discussion. Obviously, there are some red flags when you should retire. If you're having symptoms with lighter impacts, or you're having a more protracted recovery. But I do think Christopher Randolph and some of the others that have said, well, hold on a minute, maybe this is not a specific entity in a disease, and maybe it's an earlier expression. I think that's very intriguing. It's also concerning, that maybe you're going to have a condition 20 years earlier than you would in terms of your quality of life. I just recently, when I was kind of preparing for this weekend, I was looking at some of the the literature, and there's a study that was recently done in Toronto in former NHL hockey players. A number of these studies are starting to be done now where they follow retired athletes 5 or 10 years after they've retired, and they've done a battery of neurocognitive tests on them and compared them to controls, and they do pretty well. And the athletes say, that really isn't how I feel. I feel like my brain is a lot slower. I forget names and conversations. And so, the question is the objectivity of the test and how good that is at really determining whether someone has neurocognitive impairment. And when we send athletes, when we send AHL hockey players for this NHL battery of tests, very rarely do the formal neurocognitive tests come back showing black and white answers, And so I think our testing is limited in terms of providing guidance as well. And I think it probably takes decades to really see the results of these repetitive head impacts.
Yeah, almost all the athletes, especially when they've had the symptoms for more than a week, then they start to get worried, especially if they've been out of classes for more than a couple days. They start to fear that this is a longer term than what they suspected. Or sometimes the athletes, you start just having a discussion with them and said they got hit in the nose or something, and you start talking about, well, how's your head? And then they start to realize that they are suffering concussion symptoms, and then they kind of freak out a little bit because they didn't think that they had a concussion, and now they're worried about the long-term effects of it.
And I think because of the nature of what we do in terms of supporting students with the more long-term effects, we'll always be working with the student as directly as possible about kind of what's impacting them. We review documentation like Dr. Kriz or some of the other physicians. They provide a return to learn program, and that gives us some guidance as to where the symptoms are and how much the impact is and what they would recommend from a medical standpoint at that stage. We try as hard as we can to sort of work with that information and what the student's reporting to think of a plan. We do everything from helping them to decide if they might need to reduce their course load, maybe they need extended time for their work or extended time if they're going to be at the stage where they'd be able to resume taking exams. We often are working with faculty around what can be sort of postponed, what can wait. Some students, depending on the timing of the actual injury, might wait and do some coursework after the break or over a semester break, so they'd take an incomplete in a course. We'll really be working with them across sort of like what kinds of things they actually have coming up and on their plate and sort of the timing of it. So it's often a tricky process because there's so much cognitive processing needed for all the work you're doing, and how to decide when you're able to do it well enough is a very tricky thing. And I think also we work with a lot of students that, especially athletes, that are used to pushing themselves, and so this is a very different type of process to try to hold back and let go and rest. And I know there's some, we even have emergent information about sort of how you can start to resume some activity at a certain point. So I think even our understanding of how these things play out and how recovery works best, it's certainly still evolving. And so I noticed too that a lot of the students we work with have heard a lot of things or tried to, their friends have said things to them or they've read things on the internet. So they're also kind of introducing all these factors. They really want to be better as fast as possible. So kind of sorting all these things out and supporting the student. We do find too that some depression and anxiety can come along with this. And so making sure if they don't already have someone that they're working with that they know that CAPS is available, even just talking through them and spending time with them around this process, a lot of them are very emotional because again, it can be something that is a really important part of their identity. It could have been really difficult timing with the particular injury coming at a critical moment in a team's semester. So it's a lot that they're dealing with, and we want to make sure we're not ignoring that or missing those pieces.
I just want to clear up a little about the long-term neurobiologic substrate. So there's a clear pathology to CTE, which is not seen in many other syndromes. So for example, boxers, it was noted many years ago that boxers had a disease of the brain, which they call dementia pugilistica. And dementia pugilistica, the most famous person with that recently has been Muhammad Ali, who recently died. And he had a Parkinsonian kind of syndrome, which is he was slow, his motor function was slowed, and so forth. Alzheimer's disease has certain neuropathologic landmarks, plaques and tangles. They're typically in the medial temporal lobe first. They extend back in the temporal lobe. They also can be present in the parietal lobe. They're rarely present in motor cortex or in the occipital cortex. CTE has a pathology that has plaques, has tangles involved in it, has neurofibrillary tangles, but they're mostly high up in the cortical region. The question that we didn't answer about the long-term effects is whether, and I'm not sure your colleague at Loyola, I'm not sure I buy his exact argument about CTE, but the argument might be valid with respect to Alzheimer's or frontotemporal dementia, or things that we see commonly in older people. Frontotemporal dementia typically occurs in the 50s or 60s, Alzheimer's disease in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Whether these kinds of impacts give you, predispose you, depending on your genetic makeup and other kinds of makeup, whether these things predispose you to those things, those more common neurodegenerative diseases, that might be, that fits more with my understanding of the neuropathology than predisposing you to CTE, which is a very unique kind of pathology. So I'd like to ask you from Pitt, I forgot your name, but you didn't mention anxiety and depression and other mood disorders as risk factors for concussion, and I was,
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's relevant to this story.
Definitely, there is a contribution between pre-existing psychiatric issues and longer-term outcomes. Whether or not it's a kind of a psychological response to the injury, kind of like what you guys were talking about earlier about, oh my God, I have a concussion, what does this mean? Or it can be an actual exacerbation of pre-psychiatric issues, even if it is pretty well controlled. Even if you lean kind of in the anxious tendency direction, the type A, very high achieving student, and earlier, I think Dr. Johnson was talking about the hyper awareness and kind of that over scanning and everything, hypervigilance. That can also kind of lead into having longer term and, oh my God, is this my concussion? Oh my God, is this? I mean, not to say that it's not, but just that kind of thought process can kind of exacerbate symptoms and make it go a little bit longer.
I think one thing that we've ignored a little bit today is the individual variability in these things and the individual susceptibilities. And so when an athlete comes to you and says, what are my risks of this, that, and the other, part of it is, we don't know what the genetic makeup is. We don't know what the phenotypic makeup is. And people are different. When I was just walking outside a few minutes ago, one of the people from the community who came to this session was here with his son, who is a high school football player. And they had all these questions about whether he should be playing, whether he should try to play college football. And, I pointed out that we don't know what his individual genetic makeup is, individual phenotypic makeup, history.
It is a very individualized injury. That's kind of how I view it too. So.
My son that had a number of concussions, he had 10 in a 4-year period. They actually went back and said it was the original brain bleed when he was an infant. And it'd been interesting as a parent if somebody had said, hey, your son had a brain bleed as an infant. He has family members with ADHD. Maybe he wouldn't be the most. Maybe he shouldn't have been playing lacrosse, So I think over time, I'm hoping that we get to these risk factors where parents can make some better decisions about what their kids play. Back to the college level, at what point now at a college level are you suggesting that a student should probably take the rest of the semester off and go home? Because that's a question that we get, and I see more and more students sticking in because I think the resources are coming. But at what point here, which I feel is a very progressive place and very supportive, are there times where you see students, you're like, you know what, you should just go home for the rest of the semester?
I think we can all talk about it. Yeah. I'll weigh in. So I think when we first started doing a lot of this management, 10 years ago, you can hear me? Okay. We used to prescribe medical leave much more frequently, and we found it was very isolating. Their social network is here. Depression, the anxiety increased, and probably they had a more protracted recovery. So I think we've all seen the evolution of student supports, and I think what's taken a long time is for professors and educators to understand the injury, because when you look at someone physically, they look just like the person next to them with a concussion. That's very hard for people to get over. And there's the thought that, well, this person's looking for additional supports that they really don't need, particularly in a competitive academic environment, and that's challenging too. So I think it's evolved over time. We certainly have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 student athletes that probably do take some medical leave each semester, but I think we really try to provide all the resources we can before making that determination. At some point, you have to draw a line in the sand if they're just not able to get back into the return to learn, and they're really struggling with the domains as we've talked about, and you just, even with those supports in place and the therapies, they're not making any progress.
So Dr. Kriz and I had a mutual case, and sometimes it comes at the point of the year that the athlete gets the concussion. So we had someone with a first semester concussion over the winter break did not improve, and then it became a financial decision to spend over $30,000 to come to Brown for 1 semester, and within a week potentially have to go home. It was in that athlete's best interest to stay home for the semester and then return over the summer. We've had other athletes where they can do physical work, but their cognitive symptoms are just high enough that they can't function in class, they can't keep up, and after a few weeks usually, if the drop of classes does not help, then at that point the medical decision is made usually.
Yeah, and this is where Dean Grenadier would be helpful because she handles a lot of this process. But I think I can speak to a little bit of it from just being involved in some of the decision making. I mean, I think we're always looking to make sure that we give the student the opportunity to recover and to try things out in the way they want, but also to make sure that we've factored in feedback too about, you know, are things improving? Are they actually able to engage in and benefit from their coursework? Because we certainly wouldn't want them to be here for such a prolonged period that when they tried to re-engage, they couldn't get caught back up. I mean, there's certain types of coursework, like we could use math as an example. The semester is moving on while you're not attending class, and if it becomes too protracted, sometimes that's not beneficial. So those would be the courses we'd look at trying to drop more quickly potentially, but also really looking to make sure that the student feels like it's going to be of benefit to them to continue, because I think, you know, again, they've missed sometimes in certain cases a lot of course time, and that's again why they're here. So really balancing that out so they're not missing critical courses or actually not performing as well in them, because again, they're building to their career. So really kind of making sure we're thinking through that. But like Dr. Kriz said, there are so many more supports, more students are staying. And I feel like it really is those more extreme cases. And again, that's where we would factor in kind of just making sure, especially when their symptoms are really difficult to manage. It's not the easiest place to be. You know, a college campus requires you to do a lot of independent work. You're feeding yourself, you're taking care of yourself. If you're experiencing a lot of headaches, sometimes there really is that point at which would you recover more quickly if you could be home and you could relax and you didn't have to do so many of these things. So we're again trying to help them with that. I don't know, Synapse, I mean, do you work with the students?
Yeah. Definitely. So we've had a number of students who have taken time off. We've had a number of students who have stayed through, but with a reduced course load. And I think one of the beneficial things about our group is that like all the students are involved in our group. So they're able to advise other students who are new to this process, not only on how to get from step A to B to C in terms of like seeking support through the university, but also on like based on their symptoms, based on how they're feeling about their coursework, whether they should take time off from school or not. And I think that's like a really helpful thing that, you know, maybe deans wouldn't be able to provide necessarily from a student perspective. So.
There can be this perception as administrators too that we might not really truly understand the way someone who's gone through the experience and has actually recovered and come back after taking a leave, you can explain kind of the benefit of it, where it's a little bit harder for us to articulate that point. So I think it's great that these supports and resources, and I also think being reassured that, you know, taking the time off, they'd have a place to come back and actually reconnect with other students returning after a leave can be really helpful too.
And then I had a follow-up question about dealing with the teachers and how are the teachers educated, and what I've found is it's the more it's the higher level classes and the more prestigious schools that wear a blue ribbon, and it has to be taught this way, and if this child doesn't do a 10-page paper on the French Revolution, the world's going to unravel. So I find it's the higher levels and we'll drop it, dumb it down, take the lower level class. And I think in college, you're not educating everyone, you're educating those that want to be there and can afford to. And I think it's easier, but what are you finding with the administration and with the teachers that push back on this system of modify?
Well, so we work with this all the time with accommodations. So by the time they're working with our office, accommodations and services are mandated. I think the trickiest parts can be when it becomes protracted because it's less defined, because accommodations really don't involve not doing large chunks of the actual coursework. You wouldn't be able to say, well, you only have to do one portion of it. So we can't fundamentally change classes. It's how they go about engaging in them that changes. So we might delay things, we might span things over a longer period of time, again with incompletes. But I think the trickiest part can be when someone's got a protracted sort of time that they're out of class and figuring out, can they catch up? Is that reasonable for the student? And that's why reducing their load sometimes helps. It allows them to catch up. And I wish Dean Grenadier was here because she deals with the early stages and she works with faculty. They send dean's notes for this. I do think, and you could speak to this too maybe from the Synapse end when I'm done, but I do think faculty are really beginning to understand a lot more about our protocols, and they do get the return to learn forms. Those are actually sent to the faculty members so they can kind of read it in black and white where the student is stage-wise. And if they're really not able to participate in class and they've got that note, I think there is a level of understanding now that they do need to really respect that. There's obviously some interplay and discussion, but it's not a default assumption about the student not being able to continue, and I think that has really improved some over time. But
is there specific training for teachers? Do they get an in-service on concussion?
I don't think there's a specific training on it now.
No,
we
there
could
isn't.
certainly talk about that. Are you guys doing it? Yeah.
Well, we're hoping to in the future.
Yeah.
Another issue, because I work in mental health policy on the side, and one of the major things that we're struggling with is mandating faculty members to attend mental health training, because a lot of the neurodivergent students in this community have to basically become self-advocates in order to get accommodations, which is really frustrating. That kind of intersects with the concussion issue. So as much as these accessibility services are there, the student has to go and register themselves. The student has to go to the doctor and get the note. The student has to then go to the professor with the doctor's note and the dean's note and say, hi, please accept me, and then debate the professor over whether their disability is real. So that's...
Well, and technically, some of that may happen sometimes. I don't think it happens exactly like that every time.
Not every time, every time.
And I think in the case of concussions, I think there is a lot more of this proactive work that, the student isn't expected while concussed to be delivering the return to learn. So there are some built-in systems assuming the student's going to need more support. And I wondered if you wanted to add anything to...
Yeah, definitely. So that's actually one of the things we're working on right now. And I'm looking at Emery because he's really involved in our group too, but we're trying to set up a program where students who do seek support from us can be paired with another student who either has been through the process and is feeling comfortable with their academic work currently, or somebody who hasn't received a concussion but is aware of the policies at Brown that regard seeking accommodations, to send that initial email to a dean to help them deliver a note to a professor, things so that people who've had concussions don't have that burden of doing that themselves. And so that's something that I think will hopefully help with the professor interaction with the student who's had a concussion. But I do agree a little bit with Kaylin in the sense that there is inevitably a burden on the student who's experienced that concussion, because in some courses, some professors are a bit more strict or expect more of their students, especially in these higher level courses. And so accommodations aren't necessarily assumed immediately after somebody has received a concussion. And so it does take a little bit of work for some students in those higher level classes to get the support that they need in that class and to finish the class, which can be unfortunate for those students. So yeah, that's also something that I think our program can help with in terms of having another intermediary relieve some of that pressure and hopefully take some of the work off of the students' hands.
Yeah, that's largely why we have Tara on this panel, is because so much of the change at this university is driven by student organizations, and with navigating these sorts of systems, it's hard to know what to do unless you're following someone else's path, and so that's what student organizations do. And so what Tara's been doing has really been helping students who are just entering the world of concussion to navigate.
So yeah, there's two neuroscience issues here that I've observed. One is related to not knowing, from the administrative standpoint, not knowing when someone will be all better. That the unknown is very, very difficult. And you know, many of you probably know, but in population health now, one of the big goals is to do predictive medicine, to be able to predict, to have biomarkers, so you know how long these kinds of things will last. And to have a biomarker like that would really be extremely helpful. Mm-hmm. The other is, and it relates again to the fact that people tell the professor, I have mild TBI, and the professor doesn't see anything, and there are psychological sequelae of mild TBI as well as the physical ones. And if someone told their professor, I had a stroke, right? The response would be completely different. And stroke is also accompanied by post-stroke depression, post-stroke anxiety. But a stroke, there's a hole in the brain on an MRI scan. You have a definite, a definite marker of that. And so if we knew that there's a blood test, and the blood test, and when the blood test resolved, then it might break this down. It's a issue. So that feeds me what I should be working on in the research lab, of course.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, so Dr. Pallant, who works with health services here and is kind of one of the first points of contact with somebody who's received a concussion, has said on numerous occasions that diagnosis is not easy for him and for the physicians who work in health services. And so if a student, especially around like a heavy workload time, like midterm season, final season, comes into health services and said that they received a bump on the head, are feeling concussed, there is sort of an element from the physician's perspective of like dubiousness, I think, in terms of like, can the student qualify for accommodations? And that's also sort of a gray area that can be difficult, I imagine, for somebody who, is not feeling up to doing their work at the time. So yeah, I think definitely the neuroscience plays a huge role in helping students navigate that path to receiving accommodations.
I would say, that being said, I mean, at least in my experience as a Brown student, I don't think I've seen a single person who's tried to fake an illness to get out of something.
Yeah.
That just doesn't happen. I see so many more people working through all sorts of maladies that they should be taking time off for. This is a very self-driven culture. We treat ourselves very harshly at this school. It's not even pressure from other people. We're just very driven. And so I mean, that probably does happen, but I think it's far more often than not a natural problem.
Yeah, definitely.
Just to add one thing, we're working on a faculty liaison program because this idea that invisible disabilities, sort of leave people in this sometimes very sort of awkward position when faculty members are sort of looking to them. I mean, there's a fair amount of sort of an perspective of ableism that sort of permeates higher education, and so I think a lot of faculty are working from this idea that, again, you have to be able to sort of demonstrate a certain level of whatever sort of ability to push through and all of that. And so this is where I think when things are nebulous, it is a lot harder. And we're working on doing some training with faculty, and so this might be an opportunity to sort of team up and talk more specifically about this issue, because we are seeing the rise in the number of people that are sort of navigating through it. So it would be helpful for faculty to know that the idea is we want people to successfully complete courses where appropriate, and the idea then is that we need their input in a constructive way, but without making assumptions, without presuming again that this is somebody that really could be doing this, and instead working with us really closely through let's figure out how this could work more effectively, because we need their input a lot of times to really understand what happens with the missed course material, and how can they catch up, what are some appropriate supports.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
I had a parent die in May of the end of school, and we had another, I think I had another 6 weeks. And I was given the choice of, I think I had 5 classes. 2 just gave me an A. 2 said you can, come back. I guess I had 1 more year. Come back and do another year. I mean, come back and give, do your finals when you come back. And I can't remember what the 5th one was, but it was such a different degree. I think that when there's so many other situations that go on in academia where we have to make these kind of concessions, and I don't know where the place is where you just actually forgive work, because I often feel that if a student came back and just did the work that was in front of them is one set of load, but they're making up the work that they've missed. So it's kind of like coming back from a marathon, starting to retrain, but having to make up the miles you missed while you were out with the injury. And so sometimes I wonder how much of the post-concussion syndrome and the agony students are going through is that they're making up plus keeping current. And it just seems like it's a double load that a normal student can take on. And I just don't know how we get around that, because we have standards in their degrees, but are you seeing situations where work is being forgiven?
I would comment there's a lack of standardization about how that's managed. So I do this at the college, university level, but also at the high school level. And I think at the high school level, the schools that have better protocols in place have been a little bit more creative about this. So, and given it's individualized, but commonly what happens if an athlete's concussed, and let's say it's October, they're given their grade for the marking period for the work and the grades they achieved prior to that injury, and that's how they end the quarter. I think that's fair. I think at the college level it's harder. There are some courses that are requirements that can't be pass-fail, but I think in those situations maybe there should be a discussion about whether a student or a student athlete has the option of that, for that semester being given a pass-fail grade versus a letter grade or a numeric grade. Because I think all of us that manage concussion know this. The academic anxiety just leads to protracted recovery, no question. It's like gasoline on the fire with a concussion. I think we'd all agree, right? And so a concussion that you get during the academic year inevitably is going to take longer to recover than one that you get in July wakeboarding somewhere. It's just the way it is.
I can speak to this a little. Unless you. So we also see some variability within courses, because if you have a class of 300 students and you have several athletes that may have had concussions, sometimes we'll see professors that may take a standardized approach, and we've seen others that will make adjustments and work with people much more individually. Where it gets complicated is how much can we compel, and I think this is where we creatively try to use things like incompletes to buy people more time. We don't want them doubling up and overloading, and this is also where reduced course loads, at least at Brown, they're very easy to put in place, and it doesn't penalize the student because their academic standing is preserved. So I think we've tried to use those because, again, we agree. I don't think anyone thinks it's a good idea for people to have even more work to do in a short period of time. That's kind of the opposite of what we'd want. But I think the critical pieces that sometimes are involved, especially in core classes and concentrations, it may not be in a student's best interest to have missed that work. And how do we sort of figure out that balance? And this is where faculty weighing in can be really important.
I have a question question for Brown administration. So I didn't realize, but it makes a lot of sense that there's financial anxiety related to this as well. Does Brown have any, or any school that you know of, have any accommodation for the financial burden that these kids are facing?
So we totally reduce students' tuition when they reduce their courses. I think the one time that might not happen is when someone's about to graduate and they're trying to finish their degree in terms of paying for it. But again, they'd have to have the academic credits in place anyway, and so we would be working with them just to finish. People also, there is tuition insurance, which I don't know how many athletes take this out, but there is tuition insurance as well, and that would preserve someone's ability to take a medical leave without any kind of worry. That is the one piece that can be more tricky for someone who's leaving entirely. because that we can't erase the whole semester. But that tuition insurance can help. So yes, we definitely think about this component. And we work really creatively with people that are on scholarship or particular kinds of sponsorship where there might have been a requirement for a certain number of courses. And this can affect athletes too because their standing and their eligibility is there. So again, we're trying to factor in all those pieces to make sure we're not ignoring something that will have an unintended impact. So it's not a perfect process, but I think it has really improved over time.
Sorry, I was just going to ask. This is kind of. Sorry. My name's Braden. I'm a senior here at Brown. I was just going to ask on your last point about having students, allowing them to take a reduced course load and that not penalizing them. Does this kind of feel like we're putting like a time limit on, say, concussions? Because if you do get a reduced course load, that just kind of pushes it later down the line. And as it stands right now, we don't know how long someone's going to be within post-concussion syndrome. So is that going to go on for a year, 2 years, and then are you further behind? And then does that build up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm not sure there's an exact answer to it. I think one of the things we would work with the student on, especially depending on where they were in their program, is could they pick up a course on a winter session, maybe at a future point, like not immediately after the concussion, because some of those courses are online, they're a little more experiential, so it can be a very different kind of course to take. We also do work with students around taking kind of courses creatively. Some of them have interest in some of those half-credit classes you can add kind of here and there. So there are some creative ways to kind of put back courses. Again, you don't have to pay for extra in a given semester if you're adding up to 5, so some of them will catch up later. But I agree, it can have this compounding effect when things last. We also do work with some students that want to continue at a reduced rate if they do have post-concussive syndrome. So Brown has the flexibility to do that, so even though it might take longer, I think sometimes that may end up feeling like the appropriate load for someone, and we'd much rather see them finish than not. So, but yeah, there are definitely considerations in that regard. And that might be why an incomplete is the best option too, because you're keeping the course, but you're finishing it when you're ready. Because I know here at Brown, people take those incompletes out quite a good amount of time. And so we've seen people finish them, semesters later.
Right, do we have any other questions from? That's it? All right.
So now we're going to move into our sport-specific breakouts, but we have a couple of options for this. We could either break into groups within this room, and our 3 breakouts are going to be on water polo, rugby, and ice hockey. Ice hockey will be led by Dr. Kriz, as well as Braden Russell, who just asked that question. And then we have water polo led by Dr. Small, and we'll have rugby led by Mark Beakey and Beth Conroy. So I think we will break into rooms. I think we'll keep water polo in here. We'll move ice hockey to room 101, and we'll put rugby in room 201 upstairs. So feel free to attend whatever breakout interests you. That will be for the next half hour, and then we'll meet up here again for the educational capstone workshop.
So we'll be reconvening at about 3. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so the ultimate purpose of this conference is to determine an effective model for designing, implementing, and continuously improving an education program to prevent and manage sports-related traumatic brain injuries. To discuss the intricacies of developing such a program and offer an international perspective on concussion education, we're proud to introduce Mark Beakey, the co-founder of Concussion Coach, an adaptable educational platform based in Dublin, Ireland.
Thank you. So thanks for the introduction. I did a rugby talk just there, so I gave the introduction for that. So I'm gonna let everyone else kind of disseminate the rest. This is originally was a 45-minute presentation, so I'm gonna do it in 20. So if I go a little fast, I do apologize. But I'm here all weekend, so keep asking me plenty of questions. So I'm kind of just gonna skip through the intro very fast. Blah blah blah. Do have to disclose. I'll just make this into full screen, make it a little bit better. I just always want to disclose any potential interests. Concussion Coaches, that's my company. I did my education at ITT. They do also employ me, and then I have worked alongside UPMC, so they have paid me as well. So just in case, get that clear. So workshop outline. I'm really going to look at the goal of education. So why do we actually want to educate athletes on concussion? Going to look into my research phase and basically the screening the population, then look at the research phase too. How do we actually implement this? And there's a few kind of intricacies that hopefully that Brown can take on board and kind of to use when you're going forward and doing your own educational platform. So the goal, I'm kind of going to go through this part very fast because I think we all kind of know this. So we look at coach, the goal of coach and parent education. It's really kind of looking at improve the knowledge and attitude. So we want to improve the self-efficacy to be able to actually manage the injury. Improve the active communication, as we heard earlier on. If athletes don't think that their coaches or their parents approve of their behavior, they tend to think that they have a negative outlook on that. And we always want to reduce then social norms, as Christine touched on earlier on. I want to improve the documentation and logging, and that's kind of a separate whole debate, really. So it's really just those 4 points that there's numerous other ones, but they're kind of the 4 that we really want with coach and parent education. And then when we look at athletes, it's a little bit more simpler for athletes. We really just want them to improve their reporting behaviors and then their adherence to safety guidelines. So the real thing is, and the theory of planned behavior, I'm going to talk about that later on, is in how do we go about actually removing these barriers. So again, we want to improve that knowledge, improve the self-efficacy, pursue their perceived control to actually reporting the injury. And then the big one I always really want to advocate is the bystander effect. How do we get teammates to actually be proactive in helping identify any potential concussion? So again, those 4 little points. I'll move on nice and quickly. The problems with the limitations with past educational. I wanted to be as dramatic as possible, so I looked up what symbols would be the most dramatic. Anyone here who studies concussion education would know that improving knowledge is inadequate as a sole predictor of behavior. It'd be very simple if we just got everyone to be educated on something and all of a sudden they'd modify their behavior. It's a lot more complicated than that. Because if that was the case, we'd have no doctor in the world that would smoke. And that's just not the case. I thought you'd get that one. I like that. A general one-size-fits-all approach. So we kind of just throw a blanket across people and go, here's the education. It doesn't really fit well with each individual audience member. So that one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really work. And then a lot of things with passive methods. So it's great that I think America has this legislation. There is no legislation in Ireland about concussion at all. So one of the things here is that you mandate education, but each law is kind of different at what education is being mandated. So a lot of the time it's here's a sheet of paper, read that, sign it, saying you're educated. It's basically sign your life away. So a lot of the times it's very passive. Here, read this, and then you should be fine. So it's really about trying to find which are the more active methods. And then again, they might not actually have any practical utility in trying, say, modifying behavior. And the big thing, no targeted knowledge translations. I can't remember the name of the speaker, but they touched on this earlier on. That actual disseminating the information to each individual, say group or athlete or any sort of person, hasn't really been thought through a lot of the times in educational strategies. And then the long-term impact of education is pretty much unknown in a lot of cases because there's not enough follow-up investigations. So they are the limitations. So essentially when I was doing my master's, I was looking at, I kind of got landed on this, but I was doing it. I wanted to kind of put through kind of 3 studies. And first off was screening the population. So paper 1, rather study 1. So it was a cross-sectional investigation. So I wanted to know essentially what was their self-recalled concussion history, and then what was their reasons or their attitudes towards reporting. So we got 12 to 18-year-old rugby players, male in this case, so 866. And the main outcome measure was concussion and bell ringer prevalence. Now, the term bell ringer in Ireland doesn't exist, but I just wanted to model it off Register Mihalik's work because I'm a big fan. So I asked to give them that definition as best as I could, and I didn't give the definition for concussion. I wanted to see whether they were able to distinguish the two. So the purpose of this wasn't really to get an accurate prevalence rate or incidence rate. We wanted to look at this and say, what do they think they've had? And then what is the reporting of those ones that they thought they had? And the key findings for this, 40% of the population of the 866 self-reported at least one concussion, and then a bell ringer of 70%. So I believe the bell ringer definition we gave was any hard knock or ding to the head that left an athlete feeling dazed, stunned, or seeing stars. So I gave 3 symptoms of concussion and see whether they're able to spot that. They weren't able to spot that. So of those ones that I just mentioned that had a history, 38% had more than one of concussion and 86% had a recurrent injury of a bell ringer. So it's quite high. And that goes, the bell ringer goes up to 100% or 94%, I think it was, in 18-year-olds. So at least nearly every single, the older you get. So it's the higher, more chance basically. So, but nearly the higher population had at least one bell ringer, which was quite interesting. And then when we put that through to the reporting rate, so again, this is the reporting rates of their self-recalled. And it's kind of like 475 per 1,000. So you're looking at about 47%. It's quite standard amongst other literature. But the interesting one is when they perceive it to be just a bell ringer, that drops to 24%. So that's the big thing. And then again, this isn't really new to a lot of people. Not thinking the injury was serious enough. Not wanting to miss future games of training. This has been quite common throughout the literature. So again, it's that social norms, it's their own attitude, it's their own perceived behavioral control. And then again, I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see this, but as the athletes get older, they have a higher prevalence, but their reporting rates dip. So it's that kind of linear relationship. So once it goes up, they're less likely to report. And then I kind of want to look a little bit deeper into this. So I wanted to analyze that using the theory of planned behavior. And I think Christine gave a pretty good explanation of what that was earlier on, so I'll skip past that. But again, so we use the same population. We actually do this on the same day. I just took a little extra time to analyze the data. So really what I want to do is I want to understand the barriers that affect this honest disclosure. So why are they actually picking this? And can we dissect this a little further to understand educational strategies moving forward? And again, we use Register Mihalik's validative survey for this. So really, the gaps in knowledge varied among each group. So we separated that 866 into three groups, so basically 3 schools. And we found that the knowledge gaps were considerably different across each school, which was very interesting. And also, the smarter they got, the less likely they were going to report. So that was also linear. So again, knowledge doesn't equate to behavior change. And interesting enough, so when we put all this data into the model, we had that basically assessing their barriers. We looked at each group, and we had 71% of their behavioural intention to report, so how likely they were reporting injury in the future, only equated for 71%. And in that group, only 45% and 59%. So the theory of planned behaviour in this instance isn't the be-all, end-all. It has to be incorporated into a more larger socio-ecological model, which was touched on earlier on as well. But it's a good start. And so again, so we're looking at different groups. Doing that blanket approach wouldn't work here again, because direct attitude was the biggest single factor that hindered their reporting in group 1 and 2, but direct perceived behavioral control was the biggest in group 3. So it differed between each group. So that means if we screen for this before we do an educational intervention, we would know that, and we can tailor the educational strategy to suit whichever group we're working with. So essentially, yeah, just the blanket approach would not work for every group. So then I think it's a shame Christine left, because I got this idea from her. And there's a researcher out of Galway in Ireland. She's actually American, Lindsay Sullivan. So what Christine did, she looked at collegiate athletes, and Lindsay Sullivan looked at, I believe it was adults, parents of a GA background, which is an Irish sport. So what I want to do, I want to look at adolescents, so 12 to 18. What education do they actually want? So when you piece together, so essentially you could look at this in 3 different areas. First off, we had what's their self-recalled history, what's their barriers to reporting, what education they actually want. Bring all that together, and then you have an educational intervention that's targeted to that individual audience. So we went out, well, I say we, myself and I really. I did it all myself, not to brag or anything. But 2,400 participants, and I did this in an exam setting, so I didn't just send them a link, unfortunately. That would have been a lot easier. I wanted to keep the consistency. So we had the 866 from the original studies, and then we just tried to add on to that because it has been done, so we wanted to make sure our N factor was looking good. So I went out to a lot of schools and clubs, and we did this. It was only a 5-minute survey, so it was very simple, but it was a lot of, I had to give a lot of free talks. And what we wanted to do was, we wanted to explore the concussion educational histories first off, and then to see whether what history or what the education they got in the past is matching what they want to receive in the future. And we were looking at over 3 different domains. So first, modality. So what mode, what are we going to use? Who's the messenger and what area of interest? And the findings for this actually were quite interesting. Males had 2.5 times more likely to receive education. So when we're looking at female athletes, only 17% of them have received any education. So that's that kind of that taboo around, oh, well, it's a male issue. Even though 41% isn't great either. It was very interesting that only 17% had. And that was across multiple sports. So this isn't just rugby, this is rugby, soccer, GA. I'll explain GA later, that's a whole nother talk. And then the previous educational interventions weren't matching the one. So what education they had in the past isn't matching what they had in the future. And sex played a significant role in the preferred educational methods, and it'd be interesting to see this in the future. I know it's kind of difficult just to split the population just into males and females. It's much more complicated than that. A lot of different subgroups, but when we just, for the purpose of this, we just split it into 2. So when we look at modality, so what's the method? So females, out of the 590, a lot of them wanted a website, social media, or mobile app to educate them on concussion. And the informational handout, which is really surprising to me, was 40%. So that kind of passive form of education, 40% want that. Which we are kind of taken back a bit by that. And when we contradict that, or we compare that to males, again, obviously now we're all getting in this educational culture. It's not surprising that they want social media as well to educate them. But an interactive demonstration, 46%, an on-field demo. So these active, so they want to be active in their education. Well, females tended to go for a more passive education, which is we weren't able to dive too much into that, but it was just as an exploratory finding.
Did they have a chance? Could they rank them in order that they wanted them, or did they rank them in the order they wanted them, or was it pick one?
We didn't rank them in the order because I literally just didn't have the time. They could pick as many as they wanted. So, for example, so you could see here, a lot of them picked multiple ones, but. So we look at, say, what's the messenger? So females are more inclined to want a medical professional, which is good to see. A guest speaker, a specialist, and also very interesting that their own coach. So when you compare that to males, they're much more fascinated with just having a professional coach or player. So they're more fascinated with let's bring almost like a celebrity in. So let's bring, if this was a rugby group, let's bring a real famous Irish rugby player in, or American NFL player in. So they're much more interested in that type of education. But they both wanted their coach. So I'd always advocate, if a coach is educated enough to do their education, but even just having them in the room and speaking positively I think should be, just based on this data alone, would be beneficial for these groups. And when we look at areas of interest, again, we see differences. So females were more interested in the long-term complications and the impact of concussion on their academic performance. But when you compare that to males tend to be a little bit more short-sighted. We only care about short-term problems and our athletic performance, because who cares about academics? So it's just interesting that if you want to appeal to males, let's say, tell them all about how concussion can affect athletic. And then if you want to appeal to females, tell them how it can negatively affect academics based on, say, this data. Now, all this information now is exploratory. It should be replicated and done many times, but it's an interesting starting point. So the research phase 2. So I'll hurry up a little bit. So initial research model. So I went into this with plenty of hopes and dreams, and they were dashed pretty fast. So essentially taking, say, my master's work in, I want to do a pre-screening assessment, similar to what I just did there. You assess them on those three studies. You'll be able to basically make up an education intervention that's targeted, and then we want to see if this actually works. So then you do a follow-up assessment, and then another follow-up assessment. That was the plan. But geography matters, and no one in Ireland is willing to do a pre-screening or a follow-up, unless the only way they do this is if the educational intervention was free, and even then you're pushing it. But I had no government funding for this, so that went. So that led to Concussion Coach, which is the company that I co-created. and unfortunately we're not a non-profit, we are a business, so we do charge. We have bills to pay too. So our goal is to educate all stakeholders. I won't bore you with all the individual details, but our educational interventions, we go to whatever school or club we're working with, business or whatever, or what have you, and then we basically deliver deliver educational interventions, which is annoying because my whole research says that I shouldn't go in somewhere before I do a pre-screening because a one-size-fits-all approach. But that's all I can do because no one wants to do anything else. So what I try to do is to assess the barriers within the workshop. And I try work with the athletes in open dialogue, but you work with what you got, I guess. I do work with an interactive presentation type format. I try to make it as fun and learning as possible. I'm not really big into, say, didactic kind of lessons. I put scenarios to the group. I get them working in groups, get them doing lots of work. It's just, I think it's the best way for them to learn. And then we tailor to each stakeholder. So we do a different workshop for parents than we do for coaches, for teachers and stuff. We tailor it up. So the idea, I want my research to be done in a longitudinal sense because mine is very retrospective. It's very early days. So we had an Irish research coming out of Galway. It was the first really to look at this longitudinally. She's basically been doing the work I've been doing, but she started a little earlier. I'm always conscious of speaking about other people's work when they're not present, but I was in contact with her, but I just didn't have time to discuss this paper. But it basically said that once you apply it, similar to what I was talking about, once you apply that model, it did show preliminary evidence that it was beneficial. But then again, it's the first study. So the future considerations, I suppose, the theory of reason, action, and plan behavior, that framework, that model can be beneficial, but it definitely would work best in an area where concussion education is mandated. In Ireland, it's not. It's pretty much we're the only educational provider in Ireland outside of sporting organisations, so I'll let that one sink in. And government funding is always a bonus. If you can give people any sort of incentive to be a little bit safer, they will take it. I would love to see more pre-screening assessments before education is done, but again, that's going to take a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of stakeholders are willing to put in extra time. And then, of course, just more longitudinal research. Want to see if this model actually works. And then I suppose I always naturally interested in my own research, so Irish research, incorporating these models. So there's numerous behavior models out there. I just chose this one because that's the one that was mostly related to concussion. So there's the social cognitive theory, integrative behavior model. There's each different one. But I think the important one is how do we put that into a larger social ecological model? So we look at the policy, basically outside of the personal, the interpersonal. So really the key take-home points, I'm slightly gone over, I do apologise. Caitlin's looking over there, she's giving me daggers. I'll try and finish. So key take-home points, geography does matter. So I basically looked at all the research. I was reading mostly American research and Canadian. And then I thought, this would be brilliant. I'd set up all this without actually going out and doing market research in my own country and realising that people were way behind this conversation. So it kind of stunted me there. Stakeholders often use tick of the box, and this is pretty much across the globe. And different approaches may be required for males and females, so I just think it was an interesting proposal for future research, definitely. And evidence-based strategies, I suppose, use stuff that has been proven. And then screening your student population may be beneficial. It will take a little extra time, but I think having that as part of an educational model, I am working to have that assessment that I did as part of an online test. So we're trying to minimize it down in time to about 10-15 minutes, and that will be able to automatically generate an online tool at home, but we'll see about that. All right, thank you so much. Is there any questions? Are we taking questions down now?
Yeah, we have time for one or two questions. Okay.
David.
I was waving to my friend.
Oh, never mind.
Hi, Dave Eagleman from Brown. My construct of doing an education program in a university is that it should be part of what student athletes do, and they should do it. In other words, my suggestion is that the football players you should give them some reading to do, and they should come and present the material to their peers. And I can assure you the people who do the presentation, they'll really learn it well. Okay? And there's enough aspects of this so that enough students could participate and do this in small groups so they could teach each other. With some minimal faculty assistance, like what existed for this conference. Minimal faculty assistance. And so that's a model that's not used often.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because that's it's one of the projects I'm working on. I know I'm not really sure the secondary or the high school exam type thing. What's the name of the high school exams that you do at the end of the SATs? Sorry, SATs. So we have one. We kind of have a junior one and we have a senior one. So up to 15-year-olds do a junior one. At the moment, they're revolutionising the kind of. It hasn't really changed in years, but what they're doing is they're allowing short courses in. So they do a short course that's basically a branch off of, say, different subjects. And they're basically like electives, but for younger kids. So I'm working on creating a concussion one that they do for the 3 years. They present data, they do research, and they go out as and that means that basically kids have the option of learning and teaching before sports get into that more dangerous zone. So I think teaching is probably one of the best ways to learn. If you can explain it to someone else, you're going to learn it much better yourself. So I definitely commend you on doing that.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I'm one of the assistant team physicians here, but great talk, and it's really interesting to see the gender differences. I think we need to take a lesson from the ACL prevention program. So if you sit down, to your point, with football players, a lot of people will be like, this is an injury that happens to someone else. It hasn't happened to me. It's not until you've had a concussion that you start really listening and learning about it. It's a little bit different because there's been so much recognition about. But the thing that has made some of the ACL prevention programs successful is it's not just injury prevention, there's a performance enhancement piece. And so when you look at athletic performance, that's what you mentioned with males, I think that's really key. And there's some preliminary data that shows neck strengthening, particularly for rugby players. I have a colleague who works with USA Rugby, but the Scottish rugby team has a very intricate neck strengthening program, and that's been shown. There's some preliminary data that shows for every pound of neck strength you increase, you can reduce your concussion risk by 5%. So there's also anticipation of hit that has been looked at. And none of these things are conclusive yet, but I think that's the piece, particularly for a male athlete, to sell a concussion education program, because otherwise it's something that's mandated. You come into a meeting that the trainer or the coach is handing, you get handed a piece of paper. I mean, from Christine's work, video presentations for males seem to work pretty well, and someone that has street cred, a former athlete who has had injuries that is in the, I think that, and again, you found that in your data as well, that celebrity athlete, but I think we need to think about it a little bit differently, because we stand here as medical professionals and educators and administrators. I think we need to also think, how am I going to prolong my career? What can I do to be more proactive with this injury or to avoid this injury? Some of it's body awareness. I think that's what the model we need to be having.
Yeah, I think I could be wrong, but I think Christine's did a study there with Zachary Kerr looking at having opinion leaders as a part of it. So basically having someone that, it'd be like bringing in the captain of, say, one of the Brown teams who's known around campuses, and they come in and they share their talk, and that they share it to people coming in, and all of a sudden they're like, okay, if they're talking about it, then, or if they're having this positive attitude, then we can have this positive attitude. So yeah, what was the earlier point you were making about the
ACL program?
The ACL program, yeah.
So anterior cruciate ligament injury.
Yeah, so about the neck strength and all. There's just the thing I'm always a strong advocate. Neck strength for rugby is, I'm a rugby guy, so neck strength for rugby is so important. It's pretty much in every facet of the play. But in terms of, say, a concussion risk, it becomes very much minimalized when they don't see the hit coming, because you can't contract your neck quick enough. The force, it's only going to take about 5 milliseconds. So that's one of the big things that, coming from rugby coaches, we've noticed that in younger rugby, has anyone here watched rugby or anything? Am I just going off? All right, we have a few hands. Thank you. Beth at the back. Thanks, Beth. what happens at younger rugby is, okay, they're just learning how to do rucks and stuff. So they kind of put their hands on the person in front of them, and the ball basically gets passed out. And one of the biggest risks for the concussion is that they're getting hit, but when they're not expecting it. So having that game awareness, that game critique of knowing, so you could have the strongest neck in the world, but if you don't see it coming, the whole saying is the hit that knocks you out is the one that you don't see coming. You can't contract your neck muscles quick enough. That's going to stop the concussion. But if I was running at, say, in the front row, if I was running like this, I can tense my neck. I can contract it, I can stiffen it, so it will reduce the force. But definitely neck exercise, I think it's starting to come in a little bit over my side, as in terms of a return to play protocol, where coaches, because a lot of the time when you have a concussion, you're going to have some sort of a whiplash injury, so they are bringing in some more neck strengthening exercises for athletes coming up. It is a fascinating piece of area or research that I keep my ear to the ground a lot on.